Yo, what's good, everybody? In this video, I'm gonna break down and give you my prediction on the much anticipated fights between Teofimo Lopez and Shakur Stevenson. Now, to me, this is a true super fight, right? Two pound for pound level fighters, both highly decorated with contrasting styles, duking it out in their absolute prime. Um, what makes it even better is that neither fighter has a physical advantage. Both of them are 28 years old, both are 5'8", and both has a 68-inch reach. So this fight will literally be as even as can be. The undercard is stacked as well. We've got my favorite fighter, Keyshawn Davis, versus the tricky Jermaine Ortiz. Adames will defend his belt against Austin Williams. Bruce Carrington is finally getting his title shot against Carlos Castro, and Gerald Big Baby Miller is on the card as well. A very, very strong card, and I'm definitely tuning in for every fight. But getting back to Tio versus Shakur, when it was first announced, I immediately leaned Shakur. I felt that he had a stylistic advantage. We've seen the style give Tio problems before. The Sandro Martin fight is a prime example. Martin did a great job catching Tio on the entry, officially dropping him once, and honestly, probably twice. Martin won rounds by controlling distance, timing Tio, and frustrating him with that southpaw, mobile counter-punching style. And of course, Jermaine Ortiz also has success using movement. In general, Tio has struggled against movers. He hasn't consistently shown the ability to cut the ring off or close the gap efficiently. And that has been his most glaring weakness in the eyes of many. And as we know, Shakur Stevenson is revered by boxing pundits for his distance management and sharp counter-punching ability. On top of that, statistically, he is the best defensive fighter today. He literally gets hit the least. So that's where my mind was at initially. It was simple. Shakur's style looks like Tio's kryptonite. But then, I started watching film and studying these two. And after watching Tio's tape, I was even more convinced that barring getting caught by a huge shot, Shakur should be able to outbox Tio fairly easily. From the tape, I saw that Tio can be repetitive on the entry. I saw a lot of 1-2s or 1-1-2s, or sometimes he even just explodes with a single right hand without any setups. And very early into the fight, I saw Sandro Martin figure out Tio's timing, and he was able to disrupt Tio's rhythm with a jab or a check hook, which made it very difficult for Tio to close the gap. And the times that Tio did get in range, he got overzealous. He ended up smothering himself, or he allowed himself to get clinched, forcing the ref to separate the fighters and resetting the action. Martin and Ortiz experienced tremendous success continuously circling out and resetting. Tio just didn't have an answer for it. For the most part, he just followed the two instead of actually cutting the ring. And after rounds of failing to close the gap and getting countered and forced to reset, Tio did get visibly frustrated, especially in the Sandro Martin fights. And when he's frustrated, that's when he makes a lot more mistakes. He starts to walk in range with his hands down, with his chin up. He starts abandoning his defensive responsibilities, and that's when he really starts getting his head snapped back with jabs, and that's when he increases the chances of him getting dropped on the entry by a check hook. What I noticed is that once the pace is slowed and it becomes more of a tactical chess match, that is where I found Tio, struggled. He's still very good, but not at his best. You see, Tio, to me, he is a rhythm fighter. If he's the one that controls the pace and style of the fight, he can get in his bag and get in a flow state. And that's when you see his true brilliance. That's when you see excellence. However, lesser fighters than Shakur have been able to disrupt his rhythm and nullify his strengths. And that to me is when he really looks beatable. But that said, Tio does still hold real advantages in this fight. Athleticism, explosiveness, speed, power, experience at the highest level, and experience at the 140-pound division. And the fact that he has all this and is still an underdog, I feel like that speaks volumes at how good Shakur really is. Um, to me, Shakur's biggest edge in this fight is consistency. He is a far more consistent boxer than Tio. Shakur is way more disciplined and fundamentally sound than Tio, and his defense is just superb. And I honestly think this is his fight to lose. All he has to do is be himself. Implement the Sandor Martin game plan, but be cleaner and more decisive. Control distance, pick Tio off on the entry, circle the ring, clinch when Tio gets close, or take a step back and counter. Reset and repeat. That's the name of the game for Shakur. Do it enough times, and eventually Tio will grow frustrated and impatient, and that's when the bigger mistakes come, and that's when Shakur can separate himself. I believe Shakur can pull it off. He's more refined, more sophisticated, more precise, and has tighter defense than Sandor Martin. I believe he can even make it look easy. Shakur is one hell of a fighter. He's real smart, he's real sharp and skilled, and he can really make Tio look regular, guys. But he's not perfect. After watching tape, despite Shakur's very good footwork, despite him having very good balance, I found that he isn't nearly as good moving laterally as he is going in and out. It isn't second nature to him like his front back movement is. He's slower exiting sideways, he's slower countering laterally, and I saw fighters like Zepeda and Nakatia cut the ring off on him fairly easily and back him into the ropes and corners. He's also not great on the ropes. When he doesn't have space to step back and make punches fall short, he gets touched more. Really, his primary defense is his footwork. That step back counter is his bread and butter. Take away that space behind him, and he has to rely on head movement. Still excellent, but not untouchable. While Tio is known for struggling to cut the ring off, there were moments against Martin and Ortiz where he did commit to it, and he found success. When Tio decides to actually cut off their exit points and shrink the ring instead of following, he did it. He was capable. So that, combined with Shakur's weaker lateral movement, makes this fight, to me, far closer than I initially thought. And it really got me thinking of ways that Tio can actually pull off another major upset. And I gotta say, Tio can absolutely beat Shakur Stevenson. He has the tools, he has the mental makeup, and he has real advantages. He really just has to find a way to get to Shakur. He has to find a way to close the gap on Shakur, which is obviously a huge challenge considering Kerr's boxing know-how and cat-like reflexes. But I noticed that Shakur always goes back in straight lines, and I think Tio can make him pay for that. I think with Tio's explosiveness and quick trigger pull, he can possibly land something significant on Shakur as he's backing up. If Tio follows up with an extra punch or two on the entry, where instead of throwing 2 or 3 punches on his entry, he starts throwing 4 or 5, and if he implements feints, I think Tio can really make Shakur pay for exiting straight. He has the physical attributes to do it. He's explosive and he's athletic. He can catch Shakur. And I think Tio can be real creative as well. I said earlier that Martin was able to time and read him early, but that's because he was doing some regular shit, the 1-2 or the 1-1-2, as I said earlier. But in the same token, I also saw Tio later on in the fight let go of the knockout mentality, where he stops being so damn aggressive all the time, where he stops throwing bombs all the time, where he chose to box more to let the fight come to him. He stopped forcing it. You see, I believe that because of all the knockouts early in his career, Tio fell too much in love with his power. He started looking at himself as a knockout artist, and he started chasing the knockouts. But when he realizes that the big boom isn't gonna land, he started getting a little bit more creative against Martin and Ortiz. Instead of the 1-2, he threw a 1-2-2, or a feint up top, followed by a straight right to the body, followed by a left hook to the head. And those combos right there, those were successful against those two. When he started mixing it up, his creative juices started flowing, and he was able to get in more effectively, more frequently. He knows the type of fighter Shakur is. He knows the type of fight he wants to fight. He knows he isn't landing that big boom on Shakur without being creative, without setups. So I believe his mindset will be different for this fight. I don't think Tio comes into this fight looking for a knockout. I think he comes into this fight trying to make it a dogfight. I think he intends to grind down Shakur. I think he knows he's gonna drop rounds early on. I think he's gonna stay determined and patient. And I think he's gonna keep trying different combinations until he eventually gets to Shakur. Once he's in range, he has to rough him up, make it very, very physical, punch anything and everything. Tio already said there will be some borderline dirty tactics performed by him in this fight. And I think that's exactly what he needs to do. He should be punching on Shakur's arms, biceps, shoulders, hands, hips, kidneys. Shakur, as we all know, has had shoulder issues and hand issues in the past. He isn't exactly the most durable fighter, and Tio has to exploit that. This is war. Shakur is coming to his division and picking a fight with him. He has to draw the line and win by any means necessary in a fair, legitimate way. These things may be considered dirty, but they are not illegal. Tio gotta make it a dogfight, and when Shakur is trying to hold him, be slippery. Push him off. Do not allow yourself to get tied up. And while I'm on the topic, none of these two stand out as physically strong, but I noticed that Shakur really isn't that good in the clinch. His clinch game isn't refined, and he even gets pushed off his base at times. He's not that good at holding. So as long as Tio doesn't smother himself, I think he can really put in some serious work up close. Body shots is another one. Tio started early with a straight rights to the body against Martin Ortiz, and he was consistent with it, and that was beautiful. Now getting into Shakur's tape, Zepeda landed a lot of stab jabs to the body against Shakur. He landed a lot of body shots in general. I think that played a factor as to why Shakur fought the fight he fought against Zepeda. He was a lot more static. He fought on the ropes and corners quite a bit against Zepeda. Now obviously he lost, but Zepeda did well because he kept his head down and he stayed persistent. He believed that he would eventually break Shakur down, and he just worked. He never admired his work either. He just kept going. For the most part, even when he got caught flush, he fired back immediately, or he just ate it and kept chipping away at Shakur. He found success because he persevered, and he was tenacious, and he was creative with how he mixed up his punches, how he constantly changed levels. Tio has to do a lot of the same things, and I believe he can. Except Tio is more powerful, more dynamic, more experienced, and has a higher IQ than Zepeda. Now, having said all that, I still believe this is a true 50-50 fight. I can still see Shakur winning a clear decision where he completely shuts down Tio's offense, frustrates him, and starts making it look like O'Shaquie Foster versus Stephen Fulton. I can see that. But I can also see a draw. Hell, I can see either guy getting dropped or even stopped in this fight. But I can also see Tio taking Shakur to school. Every outcome to me is possible in this fight. That's how incredible this matchup is. But you know what? I am rolling with the dog on this one. I'm going with Teofimo Lopez. We got to keep in mind that this is Shakur Stevenson's biggest step up. Prior to this, what was Shakur's biggest win? Oscar Valdez, William Zepeda. Shakur is going from fighting them type of guys, the Herrings of the world, the Valdez of the world, the Haratunyans of the world, the Zepedas of the world, to fighting a proven, battle-tested, pound-for-pound level fighter in his peak form. Tio has beaten Lomachenko in his prime. He beat Josh Taylor. He beat Sandor Martin. He beat Jermaine Ortiz. He beat Arnold Barboza. His two best wins were against elite southpaws in Lomachenko and Josh Taylor when he was undefeated. Let's not forget too that Shakur is coming up to 140. This is Tio's weight class, and this would be Shakur's 4th division. How is his body gonna adjust with that extra added mass? He already said he could stay at 135 for a very long time. That making weight was very easy for him. That tells me that he hasn't fully filled out yet at 135. And now he's coming up to 140. against the king, I just think it's gonna be too much. I think Tio's boxing acumen, his athleticism, his explosiveness, I think he'll be able to earn Shakur's respect early on. Shakur is a hell of a fighter, right? But I really don't think he likes to get hit. I think he likes to keep it clean. When Tio starts letting those heavy, fast hands go, and when he starts making it real messy in there, I can see Shakur prioritizing defense, and I can see Tio outworking Shakur. We've also never seen Shakur pushed. I don't think he's ever been put in a situation where he's had to come back to win a fight. And credit to him for that. But that's something we haven't seen. I don't think nobody's ever made him uncomfortable yet. On the other hand, we've seen Tio in plenty of dogfights. He's shown us his mettle plenty of times. I can see Tio pushing a crazy pace in his fight, really weaponizing his cardio. I can see the feints, keeping Kerr on his toes. I can see the many different looks he's gonna show Shakur. But the one thing that I think Tio really needs to do to get a decisive victory over Shakur is to shoot with him. I think if Tio is successful in shooting with Shakur, Shakur's activity is going to plummet because he's gonna prioritize defense. He doesn't like to get hit. Another thing, Shakur does keep it pretty fundamental, right? He loves that 1-2 and 1-3 two-piece combo. I think Shakur gotta be a little bit more creative in this fight, or Tio is gonna time him. And several times have I seen him take a picture before. He better never do that in this fight, or he really might get put to sleep. That's just something to look out for. I'm telling you, Tio can really shock the world, people. Tio is capable of something like that. I'm telling you guys right now. Now, earlier I essentially said that Shakur is a much better version of Sandor Martin, and I still think that's true. But I don't know if he's as ballsy or as gritty or as durable as Martin at the weight. Tio really brought the fight to Martin, and Sandor ate a lot of heavy shots, but he didn't wilt under that pressure. He endured, and he kept letting his hands go. I gotta see, me personally, I gotta see if Shakur got that same type of dog in him. But for now, I got Tio outworking Shakur and winning a very, very competitive fight. But who knows? I could be wrong. Shakur can wind up completely washing Tio. His style is a big problem. Closing the gap on Shakur is a tall order for anybody. Maybe Tio doesn't get past the jab or the backhand. Maybe Shakur's feet is just too quick. Maybe he'll always have Tio fall short with his punches. Maybe his reflexes and timing is too good. Maybe Shakur is just too sharp. Maybe Shakur's IQ is just that much better than Tio's, that he's able to make the proper adjustments quicker. Maybe he's always a step ahead of Tio. Maybe he's just that much better. That could very well be the case. I'm not denying that. That could very well happen. But for my official prediction, I'm going with Teofimo Lopez by split decision. I think Shakur's lack of big fight experience is heavily slept on. Realize that this is Shakur's biggest fight against his best opponent by far. This isn't Tio's first rodeo. He's been doing this. He's had his back against the wall before, and Tio has shown that he shines under the brightest lights. His experience against higher quality opponents in the pros, the fact that he's acclimated to the weight, then you factor in all of his physical attributes, plus Tio with that underdog mentality, Tio fighting with a chip on his shoulder. Yeah, give me that. Now I might be wrong with my prediction, but one thing I do hope we can all agree on is that Shakur should not be a minus 350 favorite. Nobody should be a minus 350 favorite in this matchup. This fight is much closer than the odds suggest. Alright, so that's it for me. It's a long video. I rambled quite a bit, but I have been thinking about this fight for a while, and I just wanted to get all my thoughts out there for you guys. But I really want to know what you guys think. I know a lot of y'all aren't gonna agree, so tell me how you think this fight is gonna go in the comments down below. I really want to thank you so much for watching this video. It was a long one, so thank you. Please leave a like and subscribe, and I hope you have a wonderful day.